The November fog had settled over Mayfair like a grey velvet curtain, muffling the sounds of London's evening traffic and lending an air of mystery to the gas-lit streets. Through the tall windows of the Meridian Gallery, however, warmth and brilliance spilled onto the pavement, drawing the fashionable world like moths to a particularly elegant flame. It was the opening night of Treasures of the Renaissance, an exhibition that had been the talk of society for weeks, and I confess that I had been looking forward to the evening with considerable anticipation. My friend Hercule Poirot, impeccably dressed as always in his evening clothes, stood beside me in the entrance hall, his keen eyes surveying the assembled company with that particular intensity I'd come to recognize. His waxed mustaches were perfectly symmetrical, and he carried himself with the precise dignity that never failed to command attention, even in such distinguished surroundings. "Hastings, mon ami," he murmured, adjusting his white gloves with characteristic care. "Observe the gathering. Here we have assembled the cream of London society, yet I detect undercurrents that are far from creamy. There is tension in the air, as palpable as the perfume of the ladies and the pomade of the gentlemen." The gallery itself was a testament to refined taste, its walls lined with silk and its floors polished to mirror brightness. Chandeliers cast dancing shadows across oil paintings and marble sculptures, while elegantly dressed guests moved between the displays with the practiced grace of those accustomed to such gatherings. At the center of the main salon, drawing admiring crowds like a magnet, stood the evening's crown jewel, a glass case containing the famous Medici emerald, a stone of such remarkable size and clarity that it seemed to capture and hold the light of every chandelier. Lady Pembroke, our hostess for the evening, glided between her guests with the assured manner of one who had been born to such occasions. A woman of perhaps 50, she possessed that particular combination of breeding and determination that had made her one of London's most influential art patrons. Her husband, Sir Charles Pembroke, stood near the emerald's display case, deep in conversation with a distinguished gentleman whom I recognized as Professor Aldrich Whitmore, the noted art historian whose expertise had authenticated many of the evening's treasures. It was while I was admiring a particularly fine Botticelli that I first noticed her. She stood somewhat apart from the main crowd, near a marble column that afforded her an excellent view of both the emerald and the gallery's main entrance. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair arranged in the fashionable style and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. What struck me most forcibly, however, was her attire. While every other lady present wore the elaborate evening gowns that fashion demanded, she had chosen a simple but elegant black dress, around her neck a vivid red wool scarf that seemed to glow like a flame against the subdued colors of her surroundings. "Poirot," I said quietly, nodding in her direction, "do you see the young lady by the column? Rather striking, don't you think?" My friend's gaze followed mine, and I saw his eyebrows rise slightly. "Indeed, Hastings. Most interesting. The scarf. It is not chosen by accident, that color. In a room full of pearls and diamonds, she wears wool. In a gathering of silk and satin, she chooses simplicity. Yet observe how she positions herself. She can see everyone who approaches the emerald and everyone who enters or leaves the gallery. This is not the behavior of a casual visitor." Before I could respond, the young lady began to move toward us with purposeful steps. As she drew closer, I could see that her composure was not quite as perfect as it had appeared from a distance. There was something in her eyes, anxiety perhaps, or fear, that her elegant bearing could not entirely conceal. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low and cultured, "but are you not Captain Hastings? And this gentleman, surely this is the famous Monsieur Poirot?" "Indeed we are," I replied, somewhat surprised by her directness. "Have we been introduced?" She glanced quickly around the room before answering, her fingers unconsciously adjusting the red scarf at her throat. "No, but I've heard much about Monsieur Poirot's remarkable abilities. I wonder, might I have a word? It is rather urgent." Poirot stepped forward with a slight bow. Mademoiselle, I'm at your service. But perhaps you would first do us the honor of telling us your name. For a moment she hesitated, and I saw her gaze flicker toward the group surrounding the emerald display. I am Miss Catherine Ashford, she said finally. And I believe, I fear that something terrible is about to happen. Before either of us could respond, the lights flickered. It was only for an instant, but in that brief darkness, I heard a sharp intake of breath from Miss Ashford. When the illumination returned, she had gone quite pale. "The lights," she whispered. "It has begun." "What has begun, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked gently, but with unmistakable urgency. She opened her mouth to reply, but at that moment, a commotion arose from the direction of the emerald display. Voices were raised in alarm, and I could see people pressing forward, their faces animated with excitement and concern. Through the crowd, I caught a glimpse of Sir Charles Pembroke, his face flushed with what appeared to be extreme agitation. "The emerald!" someone cried. "Something's wrong with the case." Miss Ashford's hand flew to her throat, clutching the red scarf as if it were a lifeline. "I must go," she said urgently. "But please, watch for the scarf. When you see it again, you will know." She pressed something small and hard into my palm, then melted away into the crowd before either Poirot or I could stop her. I looked down at my hand and found a small brass key, ornate and old-fashioned, unlike anything I had seen before. When I looked up again, Miss Ashford had vanished completely, leaving only the lingering scent of lavender and the memory of her frightened eyes. "Mon ami," Poirot said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the crowd surrounding the emerald case. "I believe we have stumbled upon something far more complex than a simple gallery opening. The young lady spoke of watching for the scarf, but I suspect that when we see that particular shade of red again, it will not be worn by someone who can tell us what she meant." The evening had begun with such promise, filled with art and elegance and the gentle pleasures of cultured society. But as we moved toward the disturbance at the center of the gallery, I felt the familiar chill that always accompanied the beginning of one of Poirot's cases. Somewhere in this glittering assemblage of London's finest, danger lurked beneath the veneer of civilization, and the girl in the red wool scarf had tried to warn us of what was to come. The key in my palm seemed to grow heavier with each step, and I found myself wondering what door it might unlock, and what secrets lay hidden behind it. The commotion around the Medici emerald had reached a crescendo by the time we pushed through the agitated crowd. Sir Charles Pembroke stood before the display case, his usually composed demeanor completely shattered, his face flushed crimson with indignation. The glass case remained intact, its security seals unbroken, yet something was fundamentally wrong with the scene before us. "It's been tampered with, I tell you," Sir Charles declared, his voice carrying across the elegant gallery. "The positioning is completely altered, and look—" He gestured frantically at the emerald itself, which still rested on its bed of black velvet. "The stone! Something is wrong with the stone." Professor Aldrich Whitmore, the distinguished art historian who had authenticated the piece, leaned closer with his pince-nez, his scholarly composure beginning to crack. After a moment of intense scrutiny, he straightened with a gasp that was audible even above the murmur of concerned guests. "My dear God," he whispered, his voice barely controlled. "Charles, this is not the Medici emerald. This is paste, clever paste, but paste nonetheless." The words fell like a thunderclap upon the assembled company. Lady Pembroke's fan snapped shut with the finality of a verdict, while gasps and exclamations rippled through the crowd. The theft had been accomplished with such audacious skill that the crime had been hidden in plain sight, the genuine article replaced with a convincing replica during that brief moment of darkness. Poirot stepped forward with characteristic precision, his keen eyes surveying not the case itself, but the faces of those gathered around it. I observed him cataloguing reactions with the methodical attention of a naturalist studying specimens. There was Lionel Vane, the financier, whose brow bore a suspicious sheen despite the evening's chill. Miss Delphine March, the celebrated actress, lifted her shoulders with theatrical grace, as though the cameras might appear at any moment to capture her response to this delicious scandal. Standing somewhat apart from the main group was Stefano Rinaldi, the Italian art dealer whose dark eyes held an expression of professional appreciation for the audacity of the crime. Beside him, Felix Armitage, the gallery director, twisted his handkerchief with nervous energy, while Edith Blake, the young restorer who had prepared the mounting, watched the proceedings with disconcerting calm. The security arrangements. Poirot inquired quietly of Horace Bellamy, the ex-police officer who supervised the gallery's protection systems. They functioned properly throughout the evening. Bellamy's square jaw tightened with professional embarrassment. "The case has multiple systems, sir. Pressure sensors, motion detectors, and a closed electrical circuit. Any disturbance should have triggered immediate alarms." He paused, his discomfort evident. But during that moment when the lights flickered, there was a brief interruption in the power supply. My man Sykes was monitoring the control panel in the service corridor, but, Poirot prompted gently. "He's not at his post now, sir. Vanished, just like that young lady with the red scarf." At the mention of the scarf, I felt the brass key grow warm in my palm. Miss Catherine Ashford's warning had been prophetic indeed, and her disappearance now seemed far more sinister than a simple case of social anxiety. "The substitution," Poirot continued, addressing Professor Whitmore. "When could it have been accomplished?" "The case was sealed this afternoon under Miss Blake's supervision," Whitmore replied, his voice steadying as he fell into academic precision. "Both Sir Charles and I verified the emerald's authenticity before the final sealing. The security protocols were followed to the letter." "Which leaves only that moment of darkness," Sir Charles concluded grimly. "But how could anyone have opened the case, made the switch and resealed it in mere seconds?" Poirot's moustaches quivered slightly, a sign I'd learned to recognize as indicating particular interest. Indeed, the timing presents certain difficulties. Unless, of course, the substitution was accomplished by someone with intimate knowledge of both the security systems and the precise location of every component. He turned to address the assembled group with quiet authority. "Mesdames et messieurs, I must ask that no one leave the gallery until this matter is resolved. The police will arrive presently, but first we shall have a little conversation, you and I. For the moment, however, I require a quiet room where we might speak without disturbance." Lady Pembroke, recovering her composure with admirable speed, nodded toward a smaller salon adjacent to the main gallery. "The morning room, Monsieur Poirot. It will afford us privacy." As we began to move toward the designated space, I noticed that each person cast surreptitious glances at their companions as though seeing them clearly for the first time. The elegant veneer of polite society was beginning to crack, revealing the complex web of motives, secrets, and desires that lay beneath. Somewhere among these distinguished guests walked a thief of extraordinary skill and daring, and I suspected that before the evening was over, Poirot's little grey cells would expose far more than a simple case of theft. The brass key seemed to pulse in my pocket like a small, urgent heartbeat, a tangible reminder that Miss Ashford's warning had been only the beginning of a far more complex and dangerous game. The morning room provided a hushed sanctuary from the tumult outside, its Persian rugs and oil portraits creating an atmosphere of intimate elegance. A small fire ticked and breathed in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the silk-covered walls, while the scent of beeswax and old roses lingered in the air. Poirot positioned himself near the marble fireplace with characteristic precision, straightening an armchair by half an inch before settling into his familiar pose of quiet authority. "Mes amis," he began, his voice carrying that particular quality that commanded immediate attention. "We find ourselves confronted with a crime of remarkable sophistication. The Medici emerald has vanished from what appeared to be an impregnable fortress. Yet our thief accomplished this feat without triggering a single alarm, without disturbing any security measure. This suggests not merely skill, but intimate knowledge of every detail. Before he could continue, the door opened to admit Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard, his sturdy frame radiating no-nonsense authority. A uniformed constable and plain-clothed detective followed, the latter already producing his notebook with practiced efficiency. "Poirot, my old friend," Japp declared, his familiar tone mixing exasperation with fondness. "It seems you're always in the thick of it. The Medici emerald, no less, and during a power flicker." His experienced gaze swept the assembled suspects with professional assessment. "Indeed, mon ami, but the darkness, it reveals more than it conceals, n'est-ce pas?" Poirot replied, his keen eyes never leaving the faces before him. While Japp efficiently gathered preliminary facts from Sir Charles, Poirot observed the subtle nuances that spoke volumes beyond mere words. Lionel Vane repeatedly checked his watch, a man accustomed to controlling time now finding himself at its mercy. Delphine March dabbed her eyes with theatrical precision, yet her gaze studied the men's reactions rather than mourning the theft. Stefano Rinaldi leaned back with an almost imperceptible smile, as though savoring an intellectual puzzle. Felix Armitage's left eye twitched nervously, while Edith Blake sat with composure that seemed almost too perfect. "So the lights failed for approximately 10 seconds, Japp concluded, "and someone managed to swap a priceless emerald for a replica in a secured case without detection. That requires considerable nerve and planning." "And considerable knowledge, Inspector," Poirot interjected softly. "Knowledge of the gallery's systems, its vulnerabilities, and the precise moment of opportunity. Was this power failure mere coincidence or a meticulously orchestrated event?" "There's more, sir," the constable reported. "We've found the missing security guard, Sykes. He was discovered unconscious in a service corridor, suffered a nasty blow to the head. He's been taken to hospital, but he's conscious now." This revelation sent a ripple through the assembled group. Professor Whitmore adjusted his pince-nez with scholarly precision. "The replica itself represents months of work. Such craftsmanship requires not only artistic skill, but detailed access to measurements and photographs of the original." "Precisely, mon professeur, which raises the question, when was this forgery created, and by whom? Such work demands intimate familiarity with the stone itself." Edith Blake spoke with steady composure despite the gravity of accusations. "Every measurement was documented during mounting. Those records were strictly confidential, accessible only to senior staff, insurance assessors, and certain board members." "Yet someone possessed that information," Poirot observed. "Consider, mes amis, your thief knew precisely when power would fluctuate, understood exactly how security systems would respond, and possessed a replica so perfect it fooled casual observation. These are not the accomplishments of an outsider." Stefano Rinaldi nodded thoughtfully. "In my 20 years of art dealing, the most successful thefts are invariably inside operations. The criminal trades on trust to accomplish what force cannot achieve." My hand moved instinctively to the brass key in my pocket, remembering Miss Ashford's urgent warning. "Inspector," I said, producing the ornate key. "This was given to me by the young lady with the red scarf just before the theft. She said to watch for the scarf, that something terrible was about to happen." Japp examined the key with professional interest. "Unusual design. Doesn't match any gallery locks we've catalogued." "Perhaps not a lock in the gallery, Inspector," Poirot mused, his moustaches quivering slightly with particular interest, "but a lock in the mind. Every person here guards secrets, has something to hide. My task is to find the right key for the right lock." His gaze swept the room once more, cataloguing reactions with the methodical attention of a naturalist studying specimens. Already I observe currents of deception flowing beneath the surface. The little grey cells, they begin to stir, and they whisper to Poirot of preparation, of patience, of a plan executed with theatrical precision. The stage was set not merely for police investigation, but for a psychological battle where truth would be wrestled from human artifice through the inexorable logic of the little Belgian detective. The morning room had been transformed into an impromptu interrogation chamber, its elegant furnishings bearing witness to a parade of suspects, each carrying secrets beneath their polished exteriors. Poirot positioned himself with characteristic precision near the marble fireplace, while Inspector Japp maintained official proceedings from behind a mahogany writing desk. The fire cast dancing shadows that seemed to flicker across faces like truth and deception in perpetual conflict. Felix Armitage entered first, his nervous energy immediately apparent in the way he twisted his handkerchief into tight spirals. As gallery director, the theft represented professional catastrophe, and his distress appeared genuine enough to satisfy casual observation. "The security protocols were followed to the letter, Monsieur Poirot," he insisted, his left eye betraying him with that telltale twitch I had observed earlier. "Every precaution, every recommendation, we spared neither expense nor effort. Yet someone possessed intimate knowledge of your systems," Poirot observed gently. "The timing suggests not merely opportunity, but careful preparation. Tell me, who had access to the technical specifications?" Armitage's hands stilled momentarily. "Senior staff naturally, insurance assessors, board members, and—" He hesitated. "We employed a temporary clerk last week to copy files. I protested the irregularity, but was overruled by the committee." "A temporary clerk?" Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "Male or female?" "A young woman, dark hair, quite efficient. I confess I did not learn her name." When shown the brass key, Armitage's reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath quickly masked by professional composure. "Decorative work, I should think. Continental styling." Professor Whitmore followed, his scholarly bearing intact despite the evening's upheaval. His knowledge of the emerald's provenance was encyclopedic, yet something in his manner suggested information deliberately withheld. "The authentication process was exhaustive," he explained with academic precision. "Spectroscopic analysis, historical documentation, comparison with period descriptions. Every test confirmed its genuineness beyond question." "And yet," Poirot murmured, "tonight you identified the forgery within moments. Such certainty suggests intimate familiarity with the original." Whitmore adjusted his pince-nez nervously. "Professional expertise. Nothing more. The replica, while skillfully crafted, lacks the subtle fire that makes the Medici emerald unique." His reaction to the brass key was markedly different, studied indifference that felt rehearsed. Florentine work, perhaps 16th century, quite common in Italian collections. Lionel Vane entered with the confident stride of a man accustomed to financial negotiations, but hairline cracks showed in his usual composure. His involvement with the exhibition's insurance arrangements had provided detailed knowledge of security protocols. "The coverage is substantial," he admitted when pressed. £12 million, with specific clauses regarding theft during public exhibition. Should the stone prove unrecoverable, standard procedure calls for full compensation within 90 days. Assuming proper protocols were followed. Poirot added softly. "Naturally." The answer came too quickly, rehearsed, and I saw Poirot's moustaches quiver with particular interest. When presented with the brass key, Vane weighed it thoughtfully in his palm. "Italian work, I'd say. The patination suggests considerable age, worth perhaps £50 to the right collector." Stefano Rinaldi brought different energy entirely, his dark eyes holding appreciation for the crime's audacity that bordered on professional admiration. His expertise in Renaissance art was unquestioned, yet something in his manner suggested familiarity with less legitimate aspects of the art world. "Magnificent work, whoever accomplished it," he said with genuine appreciation. "The timing, the precision, the sheer audacity. It speaks of someone with intimate knowledge of both art and security systems." "You sound almost admiring, signore," Poirot noted. "One must appreciate craftsmanship wherever it appears, no? The thief demonstrated skills that would be commendable in legitimate circumstances. His examination of the brass key was thorough, professional. Definitely Florentine. The scrollwork is characteristic of the Medici period. Such keys often opened private strong-boxes or document cases. Finally, Edith Blake entered with composed professionalism that had marked her earlier responses. Her technical knowledge of the mounting process was comprehensive, yet she displayed unusual calmness for someone whose work had been so thoroughly compromised. The mounting required precise measurements, she explained. Every dimension was recorded, photographed, and documented according to insurance requirements. "And the temporary clerk who copied these files?" Poirot inquired. A barely perceptible hesitation. "She worked efficiently. Dark hair, well-spoken. I assumed she was properly vetted. When shown the brass key, her composure trembled almost imperceptibly. I've seen similar pieces in restoration work. They typically secured private collections." As the interviews concluded, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled in that familiar pose of concentration. "Each person tells truth placed at an angle, mon ami," he murmured to me. "But observe, they all recognize our little key, yet none admit to knowing its purpose. The temporary clerk appears in every story, yet remains nameless, and the scent of lavender that rendered poor Sykes unconscious, it lingers still in the memory of truth." The little grey cells were indeed stirring, and I sensed that behind the polite facades and rehearsed answers, the real drama was only beginning to unfold. Inspector Japp returned to the morning room with the brisk efficiency that marked his most confident moments, yet there was something in his bearing that suggested the satisfaction of a hunter who believes his quarry is finally within reach. Behind him followed a constable carrying a brown evidence envelope and a worn leather satchel that immediately caught Poirot's attention. "Right then, Poirot," Japp announced, settling the evidence upon the mahogany table with deliberate ceremony. "We've had quite a productive night. Sykes is conscious and talking, and what he has to say puts a very different complexion on this business." The security guard's testimony, as related by Japp, painted a picture of calculated deception. A young woman with dark hair and a red scarf had approached him in the service corridor, asking directions to the ladies' cloakroom with apparent confusion. When Sykes stepped away from his monitoring station to assist her, the lights flickered and he caught the distinctive scent of lavender just before something struck him unconscious. "Lavender," Poirot murmured, his moustaches quivering with particular interest. "A rather distinctive choice for such a purpose, n'est-ce pas? One might almost say theatrical." From the evidence envelope, Japp produced the leather satchel with obvious satisfaction. "Found this in Sykes's locker, along with £20 in notes and detailed photographs of the Medici emerald. Measurements, mounting specifications, security protocols, everything needed to commission a perfect replica." Poirot examined the satchel with characteristic precision, his sensitive fingers tracing the worn edges and ornate clasp. Italian leather, Florentine stitching, and observe the engraving. A tiny lily, symbol of Florence. "This is not the possession of a night watchman, mon ami. The quality speaks of taste and means." "Planted evidence, you think?" Japp's tone carried skepticism born of long experience with Poirot's theories. "Consider the handwriting on these technical drawings," Poirot replied, extracting one of the documents. "The annotations use jeweler's terminology, Bellière and Chaton, with continental accents. The sevens are barred, the script precise as a draftsman's hand. Does your Sykes possess such refined penmanship?" Before Japp could respond, the door opened to admit Delphine March, whose theatrical bearing remained intact despite the night's disruptions. She moved with studied grace, yet I detected something in her manner that suggested information deliberately withheld. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her trained voice carrying that distinctive quality that had made her famous on London stages. "I understand you wish to speak with me regarding the evening's events." "Indeed, mademoiselle, an actress possesses trained eyes for human behavior, does she not? Your observations would be most valuable." Miss March settled into the offered chair with practiced elegance. "One learns to read the subtleties of human nature, certainly. Tonight I observed considerable tension among our company, even before the theft was discovered. Financial anxiety, particularly from Lionel Vane, who has seemed unusually nervous for weeks. Felix Armitage has been receiving telephone calls that leave him quite agitated." "And the young woman with the red scarf?" Poirot prompted gently. "Ah, yes. I had seen her before tonight, at the Savoy, 3 days ago. She was dining alone, but kept watching the entrance, as though expecting someone who never arrived. When she left, she was crying." When Poirot produced the brass key, Miss March's reaction was immediate and unmistakable, her sharp intake of breath quickly masked by professional composure. "How curious. It resembles a key I once used in a production of The Italian Garden. The property master obtained it from Signore Rinaldi, who assured us it was genuine Renaissance work, not merely a stage prop." This revelation hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. If Rinaldi provided authentic antiques as theatrical props, what other transactions might blur the line between legitimate dealing and something more questionable? As Miss March departed, Japp continued building his case with methodical precision. "We've identified your mysterious young lady, Poirot, Catherine Ashford, and she's no innocent temporary clerk. She's a known associate of a continental art fencing ring, specializes in providing intelligence for high-value thefts." The evidence was mounting with almost mathematical precision. A silver hairpin engraved with the initials C.A., found near where Sykes was struck, her presence at the circuit breaker just before the power failure, her association with known criminals, her convenient disappearance after issuing what now seemed like a calculated warning. "Rather neat, is it not?" Poirot observed quietly, his keen eyes studying the assembled evidence. "All the pieces fit together so perfectly, a known criminal, convenient witnesses, incriminating physical evidence, and a swift escape. It is almost too perfect." Japp bristled slightly. "Sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one, Poirot. Not everything needs to be complicated." "Ah, but simplicity can be a mask, mon ami," Poirot replied, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire. "A carefully constructed facade to divert attention from true complexity beneath. Consider, if Miss Ashford was indeed the mastermind, why draw attention to herself by speaking with us? Why leave behind a hairpin with her own initials? These are the actions of an amateur seeking discovery, not a professional avoiding detection." He paused, his fingers drumming a precise rhythm upon the table's polished surface. "The little grey cells, they whisper to me of a performance within a performance. We are being led down a very specific path, Inspector, shown exactly what someone wishes us to see. The girl in the red wool scarf warned us of danger, but I suspect she was not warning us of her own culpability, but of the very trap into which we are now being so skillfully ensnared." The case that had seemed so close to resolution suddenly felt vastly more intricate, the shadows deepening rather than receding with the approaching dawn. Somewhere in the elegant web of evidence and testimony, truth waited to be discovered beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. The pale morning light filtered through the gallery's tall windows as Poirot paced the morning room with measured precision, his dissatisfaction with the night's conclusions evident in every deliberate step. The assembled evidence lay spread across the mahogany table like pieces of an elaborate puzzle. Yet something in my friend's demeanor suggested profound unease with the picture they formed. "Mon ami Hastings," he said suddenly, pausing near the fireplace, "what strikes you as most peculiar about this supposedly solved case?" Before I could respond, Inspector Japp returned with news that would fundamentally alter our understanding. His usually confident bearing showed signs of strain, and the constable accompanying him carried additional evidence that suggested our neat conclusions were dangerously premature. "Poirot, we've had developments," Japp announced, his tone mixing frustration with professional determination. "The hospital called regarding Sykes. His memory has cleared considerably, and what he remembers changes everything. The woman who approached him in the corridor, she wasn't wearing a red scarf at all. She wore black silk. He's absolutely certain of it now." This revelation struck the room like a thunderclap. If Sykes's attacker wore black silk rather than the distinctive red wool, then Catherine Ashford's presence at the gallery took on an entirely different significance. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, his mustaches quivering with particular interest. "Continue, Inspector." "There's more. We've searched Signore Rinaldi's hotel room under special warrant." The constable placed a leather portfolio bearing diplomatic seals on the table. "Found this hidden behind a false panel. Correspondence in Italian, detailed photographs of the emerald taken from impossible angles, and references to arrangements that began months ago." Poirot examined the documents. With characteristic precision, his sensitive fingers tracing the letterhead before carefully extracting photographs that showed the Medici emerald from angles no public visitor could have achieved. The accompanying letters spoke of the English acquisition and continental collectors in terms that left little doubt about their criminal nature. "But observe this telegram," Japp continued, producing a decoded message. "Arrived yesterday, before the theft occurred. Package secured, delivery postponed, red signal compromised. Await further instructions." "Red signal compromised," I repeated, feeling the brass key pulse in my pocket like a small, urgent heartbeat. "Précisément, Hastings. Someone knew in advance that Miss Ashford's warning would disrupt their carefully orchestrated plans." Poirot moved to examine the brass key under the morning light. "And now, mes amis, we discover something most revealing about our little key." He held it up, pointing to the intricate mechanism. "Observe the wards. They have been deliberately blocked with wax. This key opens nothing. It was designed purely to be seen, to be believed, to direct attention in a specific direction." The implications were staggering. If the key was non-functional, then Catherine Ashford had given me not evidence of guilt, but a carefully crafted clue designed to expose the true nature of the deception. "Consider the sequence of events," Poirot continued, his voice carrying that particular quality I had learned to associate with significant revelations. "A theft planned months in advance, with international connections and sophisticated preparation. Yet at the crucial moment, a young woman appears wearing the very signal that would identify her to conspirators, warning us of danger she supposedly orchestrated herself." He paused, studying each face in the room with methodical intensity. "The evidence against Miss Ashford is too perfect, mes amis. The planted satchel, the convenient hairpin, the security guard's initially confused testimony, all designed to create a narrative so compelling that we would accept it without deeper examination." "You're suggesting she was trying to prevent the theft?" Japp's skepticism was evident. "I'm suggesting, mon ami, that we have been observing a drama with multiple acts. The theft itself was merely the opening scene of a far more complex performance. Someone wanted that emerald to disappear. Yes, but not into the hands of continental collectors, into a situation where its recovery would serve entirely different purposes." Poirot moved to the window, his gaze fixed on the awakening street below. Miss Ashford knew she would be blamed for what was to come. She chose to place crucial evidence in hands she trusted would use it wisely, knowing that the blocked key would eventually reveal the constructed nature of the case against her. The morning room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Poirot's analysis had transformed our understanding completely, revealing layers of deception that made the original theft seem almost secondary to the larger conspiracy. "Somewhere in this elegant web," he concluded, his eyes gleaming with the intensity of pursuit, "a second game is being played, one where the apparent victim may be the true villain, where the accused may be the only innocent party, and where we ourselves have been carefully maneuvered into position as unwitting players in someone else's elaborate design. The little grey cells were working with increasing intensity, and I sensed that we stood on the threshold of revelations that would transform everything we thought we understood about the affair of the girl in the red wool scarf. The morning light streaming through the gallery's tall windows cast long shadows as Poirot requested that everyone reconvene in the main exhibition hall. His manner carried that particular quality of quiet authority I had learned to associate with significant developments in his investigations. Inspector Japp positioned constables discreetly, while the suspects gathered with obvious reluctance, their elegant facades beginning to show hairline cracks under the mounting pressure. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice carrying across the hushed space, "we shall conduct a small experiment to illuminate certain psychological curiosities that have been troubling my little grey cells." He gestured toward the empty display case where the Medici emerald had resided. "Mr. Bellamy, if you would be so kind as to reproduce the lighting conditions of last evening, precisely as they occurred during the theft." A borrowed red wool scarf, not Miss Ashford's, but similar enough to serve the purpose, lay across the velvet mounting where the emerald had been. The assembled suspects shifted uncomfortably as Poirot explained that during the 20 seconds of dimmed lighting, no one should move closer to the case by even a single step. "It is not the hands I observe," he said with characteristic precision, "but the minds which command the hands before they know it." As the lights dimmed to that familiar twilight, I found myself holding my breath. The red scarf seemed to glow like an ember in the shadows, and silence pooled around us like water. From somewhere in the darkness came the faintest breath of lavender, so delicate it might have been memory rather than scent. And I heard the soft chime of jewelry as someone shifted nervously. When illumination returned, the tableau had shifted in ways visible only to trained observation. Lionel Vane stood half a pace nearer the display, his financial anxiety betrayed by unconscious movement toward the object of his professional concern. Felix Armitage's hand clutched at his inner pocket with telltale nervousness, while Stefano Rinaldi's attention had focused not on the scarf, but on Professor Whitmore's reaction. Most telling of all was Edith Blake, who alone among them had not moved, yet whose composed features now showed a spot of colour burning high in her cheekbones. Not embarrassment, but carefully contained fury. "Merci," Poirot said softly, nodding for the scarf to be removed. "Most illuminating indeed." What followed was a masterclass in psychological detection. Through seemingly casual conversation, Poirot drew revelations that transformed our understanding of the entire affair. Lionel Vane's insurance discussions revealed retroactive clauses that would benefit certain parties if the theft had been orchestrated rather than spontaneous. Professor Whitmore's scholarly precision cracked when pressed about examining the stone in natural versus artificial light, suggesting knowledge of conditions that should have been impossible. The breakthrough came when Poirot produced a manila envelope that Inspector Japp had discovered hidden behind the gallery's reception desk. "Felix Armitage's private correspondence," he announced, "reveals that the gallery's financial situation is far more precarious than publicly acknowledged." The documents painted a devastating picture. Mounting debts, creditor demands, and, most damning of all, letters from continental dealers expressing interest in privately arranged acquisitions of specific pieces from the collection. The Medici emerald hadn't simply been stolen, it had been sold in advance, with the dramatic theft serving as elaborate cover for a prearranged transaction. "But observe this detail," Poirot continued, moving to examine the Caravaggio painting that dominated the gallery's east wall. His trained eye had detected what others missed: a small repair near the bottom corner, where newer paint created an almost imperceptible patch against the centuries-old masterwork. "Professor Whitmore," he said quietly, "your expertise in Renaissance authentication extends to restoration work, does it not?" And Miss Blake, your technical skills would be invaluable in creating such seamless repairs. The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably as the implications became clear. The Caravaggio bore evidence of recent alteration, suggesting that the gallery's problems extended far beyond a single stolen emerald. Someone discovered Monsieur Armitage's illegal activities, Poirot continued, his gaze sweeping the assembled faces, and chose to exploit them for entirely different purposes. The theft was designed not merely to steal the emerald, but to expose the corruption while claiming the prize through seemingly legitimate means. Edith Blake's composure finally cracked. Felix was a fool, she said with quiet venom, selling off pieces to cover his gambling debts, compromising the entire collection's integrity. Someone had to stop him before he destroyed everything we've worked to preserve. And Miss Ashford, I prompted, remembering the girl's desperate warning. She stumbled. On to the truth, Blake continued, her professional mask slipping completely. Recognized the signs of systematic looting disguised as legitimate transactions. The red scarf was her signal to Confederates, yes, but Confederates working to preserve the collection, not destroy it. The lavender scent that had incapacitated Sykes, the blocked key designed to mislead, the carefully planted evidence, all part of an elaborate scheme to expose Armitage's corruption while ensuring the stolen pieces found their way into hands that would preserve rather than exploit them. As the full scope of the deception became clear, I realized that we had been observing not a simple theft, but a complex moral drama where the apparent criminals might be the only ones truly committed to justice. The girl in the red wool scarf had indeed tried to warn us, not of theft, but of the far more dangerous corruption that threatened to destroy one of London's most treasured cultural institutions. Somewhere in this elegant web of deception and counter-deception, the final truth waited to be revealed, and I sensed that Poirot's little grey cells were rapidly approaching their inevitable, devastating conclusion. The morning light streaming through the gallery's tall windows cast long shadows across the assembled company as Poirot absorbed Edith Blake's passionate confession. Her words hung in the air like incense, heavy with moral complexity that transcended simple categories of guilt and innocence. Yet something in my friend's manner suggested that her revelation, dramatic though it was, represented only another layer of the elaborate deception we had been unraveling. Mademoiselle Blake, Poirot said quietly, his keen eyes studying her face with characteristic precision. Your concern for preservation is most admirable. Yet observe the curious contradiction. You speak of saving the collection through theft, of protecting art through criminal conspiracy. The little grey cells, they whisper to me that such noble motives often mask more complex truths. Before Blake could respond, the gallery's main doors opened with timing so perfect it might have been choreographed for one of Miss March's theatrical productions. Catherine Ashford entered, no longer wearing the distinctive red wool scarf that had marked her earlier appearance, but dressed in simple black silk that matched Sykes's corrected description of his attacker. Her presence electrified the room, yet her demeanor carried none of the desperate anxiety I remembered from our brief encounter. Instead, she moved with quiet authority, her intelligent eyes surveying the assembled suspects with what I now recognized as professional assessment. Miss Ashford, Poirot said, rising with courteous precision, your dramatic exit left many questions unanswered. Your return suggests information of considerable importance to our investigation. Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, she replied, her cultured voice steady despite the gravity of circumstances. I believe the time has come for complete honesty about the events of last evening and the weeks that preceded them. She produced a leather portfolio from her handbag, its official seals immediately catching Inspector Japp's professional attention. I'm not merely Catherine Ashford, temporary clerk and art enthusiast. I'm Inspector Catherine Ashford of Scotland Yard's Art Crime Unit, working undercover to investigate systematic looting from London's most prestigious galleries. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow, yet Poirot's expression suggested this development confirmed rather than surprised him. Ah, Inspector Ashford. The blocked key, the theatrical warning, the convenient disappearance, all designed to place crucial evidence in hands that would use it wisely while maintaining your cover long enough to complete your investigation. Precisely. Our operation began 6 months ago when patterns emerged across multiple institutions, pieces disappearing during renovations, temporary replacements becoming permanent, authentication documents that couldn't withstand detailed scrutiny. She opened the portfolio to reveal photographs, financial records, and correspondence that painted a devastating picture of organized cultural theft. The evidence was overwhelming, yet something in Poirot's manner suggested deeper currents still unexplored. Felix Armitage stood pale and trembling, his financial desperation now exposed in its full pathetic reality. Professor Whitmore adjusted his pince-nez nervously, scholarly dignity cracking under the weight of implied complicity. Stefano Rinaldi maintained his elegant composure, though his dark eyes held calculation rather than surprise. The Medici emerald presented unique challenges, Inspector Ashford continued. Its fame made outright theft impossible to conceal, yet its value made it irresistible to the syndicate. The solution required someone with intimate knowledge of the gallery's systems, someone trusted enough to access the most secure areas without suspicion. And yet, Poirot interjected softly, the theft proceeded despite your investigation, despite your warnings, despite the considerable resources of Scotland Yard. This suggests either remarkable criminal skill or— His gaze swept the assembled faces. The involvement of someone whose position placed them above suspicion. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Inspector Ashford's revelation had transformed our understanding of her role, yet Poirot's manner indicated that the most crucial revelations still lay ahead. The red wool scarf, he continued, his voice carrying that particular quality I'd learned to associate with significant deductions, was indeed a signal, but not to criminal confederates. It marked you, Inspector, to those who would recognize its significance. Yet it also marked you to someone else, someone who understood its true meaning and chose to exploit that knowledge for their own purposes. The brass key in my pocket seemed to pulse with renewed significance as Poirot's analysis revealed layers of deception within deception. Somewhere in this elegant web of noble motives and criminal actions, the final truth waited to be exposed, and I sensed that the psychological game was entering its most dangerous phase. The lavender that incapacitated poor Sykes, Poirot observed, his gaze fixing on the restoration supplies visible through the workshop's open door, came from materials readily available to someone with access to conservation facilities. The precise timing required someone who understood both security rotations and electrical systems. The replica's mounting demanded tools and expertise available only to a trusted member of the staff. As the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge, I realized we were observing not merely theft, but a complex moral drama where traditional concepts of guilt and innocence dissolved into shades of gray that would challenge even Poirot's legendary powers of resolution. The girl in the red wool scarf had indeed tried to warn us, but of dangers far more complex and morally ambiguous than simple criminal conspiracy. The little grey cells were working with increasing intensity, and somewhere in the elegant morning room, beneath the veneer of civilized discourse, the final confrontation was rapidly approaching. The morning light streaming through the gallery's tall windows had taken on an almost theatrical quality, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and dance as the assembled company absorbed Inspector Ashford's revelation. Yet something in Poirot's manner suggested that her disclosure, dramatic though it was, had merely cleared away the surface mist to reveal far deeper currents beneath. "Inspector Ashford," Poirot began, his voice carrying that particular quality of quiet authority that marked his most significant deductions, "your courageous work has illuminated much. Yet observe how it has also provided perfect cover for a different game entirely. The little grey cells, they whisper to me of someone who understood your investigation from the beginning and chose to exploit it with remarkable sophistication. He moved toward the empty display case with characteristic precision, his keen eyes studying not the security apparatus, but the faces of those who watched him. Consider, mes amis, the sheer audacity of this crime. A theft executed during a power failure that lasted mere seconds, yet accomplished with such precision that it suggests not desperate improvisation, but careful rehearsal. Someone knew exactly where to find every component, exactly how long each step would require. Professor Whitmore adjusted his pince-nez with nervous precision, yet something in his scholarly bearing had begun to crack under the mounting pressure. Surely, Monsieur Poirot, professional criminals possess such skills. Ah, but that is precisely what troubles me, mon professeur, Poirot replied, producing a small evidence envelope from his waistcoat. Observe this fragment of wax, tinted with verdigris, found where our mysterious attacker struck poor Sykes. The green tint comes from copper compounds used in conservation work, not the tools of common criminals, but the materials of restoration experts. He held up the brass key once more, its ornate surface catching the morning light. This little key was blocked with the same wax compound, rendered useless for any practical purpose. Yet someone wanted us to believe it held significance, to follow a trail that led away from the true culprit. The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably as Poirot's analysis revealed the deeper architecture of deception. The replica emerald represents months of meticulous work, not merely copying the stone's appearance, but understanding its every flaw, every inclusion, every subtle characteristic that would convince even expert examination. Such knowledge requires not photographs or measurements, but intimate, prolonged access to the original. His gaze settled on Lionel Vane, whose financial expertise had positioned him perfectly within the conspiracy. The insurance arrangements were indeed crucial, Monsieur Vane, but not in the way we initially supposed. The swift payout would serve not merely to cover financial irregularities, but to establish provenance for the recovered original when it eventually surfaced in a private collection. "You're suggesting the emerald was meant to be found?" Inspector Ashford asked, her professional instincts sharpening. "More than found, Inspector. Authenticated. By someone whose scholarly reputation would place its genuineness beyond question." Poirot's attention fixed upon Professor Whitmore with laser-like intensity. "Last evening, you identified the forgery within moments of examination. Such certainty speaks not merely of expertise, but of prior knowledge. You knew it was false because you yourself commissioned its creation." A collective intake of breath swept through the assembled company. Whitmore's scholarly composure finally began to crumble, his face paling as the implications became clear. "The authentication process gave you unlimited access to study the original," Poirot continued relentlessly. "Spectroscopic analysis, detailed photography, precise measurements, all legitimate scholarly work that provided everything necessary to commission a perfect replica. Yet your true genius lay not in the theft itself, but in the timing." He moved closer to Whitmore, his voice dropping to that conversational tone that somehow carried more menace than any shout. Inspector Ashford's investigation threatened to expose systematic looting across London's galleries. You realized that her presence provided perfect cover for your own scheme, a theft that would appear to be part of the international conspiracy she was investigating, while the real emerald disappeared into your private collection. "The lavender that incapacitated Sykes," Poirot added, producing another evidence envelope, "came from your personal collection of rare botanical essences. The cotton glove that left traces on the display case bore fibers consistent with conservation materials. Even the satchel planted in Sykes's locker contained handwriting samples that, upon closer analysis, revealed the distinctive penmanship of a scholar accustomed to detailed annotations." Whitmore's pince-nez trembled in his grasp. "This is all speculation, Monsieur Poirot. You have no proof of these wild accusations. do I not?" Poirot smiled with quiet satisfaction. "The red wool scarf was indeed a signal, Professor, but you misunderstood its meaning. When you saw Inspector Ashford wearing it, you assumed she was communicating with criminal confederates. You exploited that assumption to frame her for your own crime, not realizing that she was actually identifying herself to her Scotland Yard contacts." The web of deception was becoming clearer with each revelation, yet I sensed that Poirot was still holding back his most devastating conclusions. The psychological game had reached its most dangerous phase, where the accused would either confess or make one final desperate gambit to escape justice. "The true brilliance of your scheme," Poirot concluded, his eyes gleaming with the intensity of pursuit, "lay not in stealing the emerald, but in positioning yourself to control its eventual rediscovery. As the world's leading authority on Renaissance gems, you alone could authenticate its return to the legitimate market, commanding both scholarly recognition and substantial financial reward." Professor Whitmore stood frozen, caught between confession and continued denial, while the assembled company waited for his response. Somewhere in the elegant morning room, beneath the veneer of civilized discourse, the final confrontation was rapidly approaching, and I realized that the girl in the red wool scarf had indeed tried to warn us of betrayal from the very quarters where trust should have been absolute. The little grey cells had done their work, yet I sensed that the most dramatic revelations still lay ahead in Poirot's inexorable march toward complete and devastating truth. The silence stretched until Professor Whitmore's scholarly composure cracked like ancient varnish, revealing the desperate calculation beneath. His eyes darted not toward escape, but toward the Caravaggio that dominated the gallery's east wall, and I saw Poirot's moustaches quiver with particular satisfaction. "Ah, mon professeur," Poirot said quietly, "your gaze betrays you. The little grey cells, they have been most curious about that particular masterwork and its recent restoration." He gestured toward Edith Blake. "Mademoiselle, your conservation lamp, if you please, and the fine scalpel for examining surface anomalies." Blake moved with mechanical precision, her professional training overriding the mounting tension. As she positioned the raking light across the canvas, that small patch near the lower corner bloomed into visibility, a repair that gleamed with suspicious freshness against the centuries-old surface. "Observe," Poirot continued, producing the brass key and warming it briefly under the lamp until the blocked wax softened, releasing its telltale scent of lavender. The same copper-tinted compound found where poor Sykes was struck, but this wax served a different purpose entirely. With watchmaker's precision, he pressed the key's flattened edge against the glossy repair. The surface yielded with a soft, tacky resistance, revealing beneath not canvas, but a carefully cut cavity in the painting's backing board. "The rehearsal before the performance," Poirot murmured, withdrawing a small black silk parcel from the hidden recess. As he unwrapped it, green fire caught the morning light with unearthly brilliance. The Medici emerald lay in his palm like a sleeping dragon finally awakened. Inspector Ashford stepped forward, her professional composure masking what must have been considerable satisfaction. "The cavity was prepared well in advance, during your after-hours access to study natural light patterns, Professor. Our forensic team found traces of the same verdigris wax in your private laboratory." 10 seconds of darkness, Poirot continued relentlessly, was sufficient time for someone who had rehearsed the precise movements required. Insert the genuine stone, seal with prepared wax, position the replica in the display case, all accomplished with the efficiency of a practiced routine. Whitmore's face had gone ashen, yet he managed one final protest. "Circumstantial evidence proves nothing. You cannot—" "Cannot what, Professor?" Inspector Ashford interrupted, producing a leather portfolio. "Cannot prove that you commissioned the replica through intermediaries 6 months ago? Cannot demonstrate that your botanical laboratory produced the lavender compound used to incapacitate Sykes? Cannot show the coded correspondence arranging for the stone's eventual rediscovery, and authentication by your own expert testimony. The evidence was overwhelming, yet something in Poirot's manner suggested one final revelation remained. His gaze fixed upon Edith Blake, whose composed professionalism had begun to crack under the mounting pressure. "Mademoiselle Blake," he said gently, "your horror at the shoddy repair work was genuine, because you would never permit such haste in legitimate restoration. Yet your access to conservation materials, your intimate knowledge of the gallery's security systems, your ability to create perfect mounting specifications for the replica, all suggest that your noble desire to preserve the collection was exploited by someone who understood your vulnerabilities." Blake's professional mask finally shattered completely. He said it was the only way to expose Felix's corruption without destroying the gallery's reputation. She whispered. The emerald would be safe, he promised, eventually returned to a more worthy institution. I believed I was protecting everything we had worked to preserve. "And Miss March?" Poirot prompted. "A small favor," Delphine March admitted, her theatrical composure intact but hollow. "A gentleman of such scholarly distinction requesting assistance with what seemed a harmless diversion. I wore black silk as requested, provided the distraction Professor Whitmore required. I did not know the true purpose." The web of deception lay fully exposed, a respected scholar corrupted by avarice, a dedicated conservator manipulated by false nobility, an actress unknowingly playing a role in criminal theater. Each had contributed to a conspiracy that exploited their finest qualities for the basest purposes. Inspector Japp stepped forward with grim satisfaction. "Professor Aldrich Whitmore, I'm arresting you on suspicion of theft, conspiracy, and assault. You need not say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." As the constables moved to escort Whitmore away, he made one desperate lunge toward the Caravaggio, perhaps hoping to destroy the evidence of his elaborate deception. Poirot's walking stick intercepted him with casual precision, and the fight went out of him like air from a punctured balloon. "The impulse to destroy," Poirot observed sadly, "is always the final refuge of minds that have betrayed beauty." The morning light streaming through the gallery's windows had taken on a cleaner quality, as though the exposure of truth had somehow purified the very air. The girl in the red wool scarf had indeed tried to warn us, not of simple theft, but of corruption that threatened the very foundations of cultural preservation. As Poirot carefully rewrapped the emerald and handed it to Inspector Ashford, I realized that we had witnessed not merely the solution of a crime, but the unraveling of a moral tragedy where noble intentions had been perverted into sophisticated criminality by the very expertise meant to protect what was most precious. The gallery exhaled at last, the murmur of shaken patrons ebbing toward the doors, while constables moved with quiet efficiency through the exhibits. The Medici emerald, bright as captured starlight, vanished into Inspector Ashford's sealed evidence pouch with a gravity that sobered even the most persistent gossips. Lady Pembroke thanked Poirot with pale dignity, while Sir Charles gripped Inspector Japp's hand like a lifeline. The morning light streaming through the tall windows had taken on a cleaner quality, as though the exposure of truth had somehow purified the very air. Inspector Japp shed his satisfaction for procedure with characteristic briskness. "Whitmore goes before the magistrate at noon. We'll need scenes of crime examination at the university laboratory, his private rooms, and that Swiss bank account we've traced. Rinaldi's continental correspondence earns him extended questioning, possibly extradition proceedings. Vane, those curious insurance riders, will require detailed explanation to the fraud investigators. Armitage, surrender all keys and ledgers immediately." The fates of the conspirators. Felix Armitage folded into himself with the defeated air of a man whose weakness had been exploited beyond redemption. His financial desperation, while not excusing his compromise of the collection, had made him vulnerable to Whitmore's increasingly sophisticated manipulation. The systematic replacement of genuine pieces with clever forgeries would have continued indefinitely without Inspector Ashford's investigation. Stefano Rinaldi requested legal counsel with elegant composure, though his dark eyes now held calculation rather than appreciation for criminal artistry. His continental network of artisans had been exploited without his knowledge of the true criminal purpose. Yet his connections would require extensive investigation by international authorities. Lionel Vane's financial expertise had provided crucial intelligence about authentication processes and insurance recovery protocols, information the professor had exploited with diabolic precision. His legal team was already coordinating damage control, though the shadow of his unwitting complicity would linger over his carefully constructed empire. Delphine March, having given her statement with theatrical precision, dabbed delicately at her eyes, though whether for her tarnished reputation or genuine remorse remained unclear. Her professional desire to please a distinguished scholar had made her an unwitting instrument in the deception. Poirot's complete analysis. When the immediate tumult subsided, Poirot arranged his notebook with characteristic precision and regarded the assembled company with those keen eyes that missed nothing. Mes amis, we have witnessed this evening not merely theft, but a masterclass in the corruption of noble impulses. The professor's scheme possessed diabolic elegance precisely because it exploited each person's finest qualities as instruments of deception. He gestured toward Inspector Ashford, who had removed her disguise completely to reveal the crisp efficiency of her official bearing. The red wool scarf was indeed a stroke of genius, Inspector. A signal visible only to those who knew its meaning, yet also powerful misdirection for those who did not. It permitted you to communicate directly with us while maintaining your cover among those who would recognize its significance. It was a calculated risk, Monsieur Poirot, she admitted. We knew Whitmore had informants within our own investigation, and that he possessed remarkable skill at psychological profiling. The brass key, blocked with verdigris wax and rendered useless, was designed to waste his time while we gathered final evidence. When you see that particular shade of red again, I had said, meaning when the investigation reached its conclusion. Poirot nodded with satisfaction. The little grey cells, they whispered to me from the beginning that this was never about mechanism, but about mind. The perfume was lavender, yes, but of the laboratory, not the boudoir. Poor Sykes breathed a conservator's compound. The barred sevens on the forged documents, the scholar's precise hand disguised as a watchman's scroll. It was all too neat, too perfect to be genuine criminal work. The broader corruption. Inspector Ashford produced her comprehensive report, its pages documenting a conspiracy that extended far beyond the Meridian Gallery. Our investigation has uncovered systematic looting across London's cultural institutions, museums, private collections, ecclesiastical treasures. Professor Whitmore's scholarly reputation provided access to virtually any collection he wished to study, while his authentication services allowed him to legitimize stolen pieces' return to market circulation. The professor's greatest crime, Poirot continued, his voice heavy with moral gravity, was not theft, but betrayal of trust. He corrupted the very systems designed to preserve humanity's cultural heritage, turning scholarship itself into an instrument of destruction. Such betrayal wounds not merely individuals, but civilization itself. The human tragedy. Edith Blake, her initial fury giving way to profound disillusionment, sat quietly with her head bowed. The betrayal by a man she had respected, whose vision she had believed served preservation, was a wound deeper than any legal consequence. Poirot approached her with compassionate understanding. Mademoiselle Blake, the desire to preserve beauty, to protect art from corruption, is among the noblest of human impulses. It is tragedy when such purity of intent is exploited by those who understand its power. The professor convinced you that removing the emerald served scholarship, that private ownership would preserve it better than public display. Such rationalization allows even the most educated minds to justify the most heinous betrayals. Final resolution. As the morning strengthened and the last of the official procedures concluded, Inspector Ashford visited us at Whitehaven Mansions, bringing violets that scented the room with gentler memories than the criminal lavender that had begun our adventure. She wore no scarf of any color. "I owe you both an apology," she said. "My warning endangered the operation, yet it proved necessary to ensure the truth emerged completely." Poirot bowed with courteous precision. "It preserved the essential thing, Inspector. Not merely evidence, but justice itself. The girl in the red wool scarf chose visibility over concealment. It is a brave color, that red, bright enough for allies to find, distinctive enough that villains underestimate its true meaning." Poirot's philosophical conclusion. That evening, as we dined in our familiar haunts, Poirot grew unusually reflective, stirring his tisane while considering the dancing flames. "To possess beauty is a temptation, Hastings. To guard it is a duty. Between the two lies a narrow path, and only order and method keep one's feet upon it." Our professor stepped aside for admiration and profit. Mademoiselle Blake slipped from love. One strolled deliberately into corruption, the other was led astray by noble intentions perverted. "The outcome," he continued, his eyes holding that faraway look that signaled deep philosophical consideration, "is that justice, while imperfect, has been served. The emerald, symbol of enduring beauty, is restored. But the human heart, mon ami, remains a labyrinth of desires and deceptions, a puzzle far more intricate than any jewel. We have witnessed how the finest qualities of human nature, scholarship, dedication, artistic appreciation, can be corrupted when trust is betrayed by those in whom it is most naturally placed." Outside, the November fog had returned, wrapping London in its familiar embrace. Poirot adjusted his hat with characteristic precision and took my arm. The Meridian Gallery would settle back into its role as quiet repository of art, but the echoes of the night's revelations would linger, a reminder that beneath society's polished surfaces, the eternal struggle between preservation and corruption, between noble purpose and base exploitation, continues with each new generation of guardians and those who would exploit their dedication. The affair of the girl in the red wool scarf had ended, but its lessons about the fragility of trust and the courage required to defend truth would endure long after the emerald's fire had been safely secured behind new and better protected glass. The November fog had lifted from London streets by week's end, leaving the city sharp-edged and purposeful, as though the exposure of truth had somehow clarified the very air. The Meridian Gallery stood shuttered temporarily, its elegant facade bearing discreet notices of renovation and enhanced security measures, while inside, specialists worked to catalogue and authenticate every piece in the collection. The Medici emerald itself rested in Scotland Yard's most secure vault, awaiting its eventual return to the Italian government with appropriate ceremony. The resolution of justice. Professor Aldrich Whitmore faced the magistrate on a grey Thursday morning, his scholarly dignity stripped away to reveal the calculating criminal beneath. The evidence against him proved overwhelming. Swiss bank accounts, containing nearly £500,000, a private collection in Venice housing stolen treasures from across Europe, and correspondence revealing a network of continental dealers who had unknowingly facilitated his crimes. His confession, when it finally came, possessed the same meticulous precision that had marked his academic work, yet served only to underscore the magnitude of his betrayal. Felix Armitage resigned his directorship in disgrace, his nervous energy finally stilled by the weight of professional ruin. The gambling debts that had made him vulnerable to Whitmore's manipulation would follow him into obscurity, a cautionary tale of how financial desperation could transform a guardian of culture into its unwitting betrayer. Stefano Rinaldi departed London with affronted dignity and a first-class ticket to Rome, though his elegant composure masked growing concern about the international investigation, now scrutinizing his continental connections. His network of artisan contacts, exploited without his knowledge for criminal purposes, would require extensive examination by authorities across 3 countries. Lionel Vane found his financial empire shadowed by questions about those curious insurance clauses and his professional relationship with the disgraced professor. While not directly implicated in theft, his reputation suffered the kind of damage that spreads through the city like smoke, subtle but pervasive. Delphine March returned to her stage with characteristic theatrical flair, her unwitting role in the deception having been accepted with surprising public sympathy. Her genuine shock at being manipulated by a respected academic resonated with audiences who understood the vulnerability of trusting souls in a world of sophisticated deception. The deeper truth. Inspector Catherine Ashford visited us at Whitehaven Mansions on a crisp December afternoon, no longer disguised but wearing the efficient bearing of her official rank. She brought news that cast the entire affair in an even more complex light, revealing that Edith Blake's involvement had been far more sophisticated than any of us had initially understood. The conservator was conducting her own investigation, Inspector Ashford explained, settling her leather portfolio on Poirot's precisely arranged side table. She discovered Whitmore's activities months earlier and had been gathering evidence while pretending continued cooperation. The shoddy repair work on the Caravaggio was deliberately obvious. She knew it would eventually draw attention to the hidden cavity. This revelation transformed our understanding of Blake's composed demeanor during questioning. Her apparent fury at being discovered had been carefully calculated performance, designed to maintain her cover while ensuring justice prevailed. The lavender compound that incapacitated Sykes had indeed come from her laboratory, but through Whitmore's manipulation of her, research into historical conservation techniques. She walked the narrow line between justice and vigilantism with remarkable skill, Poirot observed, his mustaches quivering with particular satisfaction. The little grey cells sensed something incomplete about her confession, too genuine to be mere performance, yet too precise to be coincidental. Poirot's final analysis. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across our familiar sitting room, Poirot reflected on the moral complexities that had defined the case from beginning to end. The brass key lay on the mantelpiece, its ornate surface catching the winter light, a tangible reminder of how the simplest objects could carry the most complex meanings when viewed through the lens of human deception. "We have witnessed, mon ami," he said, settling into his chair with characteristic precision, a drama where apparent victims were true heroes, where trusted authority concealed genuine villainy, and where justice required deception to triumph over sophisticated corruption. The professor's greatest crime was not theft, but betrayal of trust, corrupting the very systems designed to preserve humanity's cultural heritage. He paused, his keen eyes studying the dancing flames in our fireplace. The girl in the red wool scarf chose visibility over safety, truth over convenience. In a world where corruption often hides behind respectability, such courage becomes not merely admirable, but essential for civilization's preservation. The symbolic legacy. Inspector Ashford rose to leave, her official duties calling her back to the continuing investigation of Whitmore's international network. As she reached the door, she offered one final observation that would linger in our memories long after the case files were sealed. "The emerald has been returned to the gallery under enhanced security," she said. "But perhaps the most valuable treasure recovered was something less tangible. The reminder that even our most trusted institutions require constant vigilance to protect them from those who would exploit public trust for private gain. The enduring lesson." That evening, as London settled into its familiar rhythms of light and shadow, Poirot and I walked the streets where ordinary citizens pursued their daily lives, unaware of the complex moral dramas that had played out in the institutions they trusted to preserve their cultural heritage. The human heart remains a labyrinth. Hastings, Poirot mused, adjusting his hat with characteristic precision. Between the desire to possess beauty and the duty to guard it lies a narrow path, and only order and method keep one's feet upon it. Our professor stepped aside for admiration and profit, while Mademoiselle Blake slipped from love. One strolled deliberately into corruption, the other was led astray by noble intentions, perverted. The brass key in my pocket seemed to pulse with symbolic weight, a reminder that even the most elaborate deceptions eventually yield to the persistent application of logic, observation, and that quality Poirot prized above all others, the courage to pursue truth regardless of where it might lead. The affair of the girl in the red wool scarf had concluded, but its lessons about trust, betrayal, and the complex moral landscape of modern life would endure. In a world where appearances often deceive and authority sometimes corrupts, the simple act of wearing truth as boldly as a red wool scarf becomes both a beacon for allies and a challenge to those who would prefer their crimes remain hidden in shadow. Outside our window, London continued its eternal dance of civilization and culture, while somewhere in the city's galleries and museums, dedicated guardians maintained their quiet vigil over humanity's treasures, armed now with the knowledge that even the most sophisticated criminals can be defeated by the careful application of method, order, and the unwavering pursuit of justice.